What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Twinmotion video. In this video, we're going to look at 2024.1. It's obviously just a preview, but it's out and it's here. It's got tons of updates, and I can't believe how much is in here. It's insane. I mean, yeah, I'm going to try and keep this at a shorter video if I can, knowing that there will be other videos covering each one of these specific updates, as there are quite a lot. So I'm going to try my best to cover everything. The link to all the new updates in the release will be in the description as usual, so check that out. Follow along with me here. So obviously tons of things to look at. So before we get into it, if at any point in this video you happen to learn something or you just enjoy this type of content, please demolish that like button. Really helps me out quite a lot. Okay, so there's a lot to digest here. And so the first thing we're going to say is Unreal Engine 5.4 is out. I'd highly recommend you look at what that is and what that means. That doesn't mean a whole lot to Twinmotion other than the fact that we have the capabilities, or let's say the quality from Unreal Engine 5.4 kind of automatically baked in to Twinmotion. And if you're using Lumen or Path Tracer, which, let's be honest, if you're exporting anything, I hope you are, and you really should be. So anyways, we just basically get extra quality. Beyond that, of course, we have new pricing that works out. And so basically, you can basically use Twinmotion for free, which is fantastic. And I'll make another video on that and how it works and why they might have done that, whatever, my thoughts on it, but not a big deal now. But really, we're looking at all the new updates, and there's a ton. So again, that 5.4 support for Unreal, anything with that, you can take any Datasmith file and take that and open it directly within Unreal Engine 5.4. We're not going to do that in this video, but just know that there's no specific importer or weird process that you need to go through. It just works and goes into 5.4 directly, which is awesome. Okay, let's look at the new Twinmotion updates here. We've got, of course, spacing and area tools, which, what is that? Well, when it comes to the populate here, I'm going to open up this populate tab, and we're very familiar with objects, foliage, whatever. Usually I'm using this for foliage, and I'm painting or scattering. We're very familiar with this. If we expand our library here, vegetation, all of these types of grasses and flowers, these are things that we would want to scatter out. We've been able to do that by painting, and of course by scattering, where you just select an object and it scatters that throughout the object, which is fantastic. These two tools are nothing new, but what is new is spacing. And this is, I have to be honest, I'm very impressed with this. So I'm going to zoom out some. So basically, we're going to work with this area. And let's go back here. And I literally just start drawing. You can see I've got a circle. And really what I'm doing is editing this spacing. And so you can see I've got a path here. And by default, we're working with some of these. If you've used the pen tool before in like Photoshop, other Adobe products, it basically works the same way, to where it's gonna give you this angle curve. It's not necessarily straight by default, but we can work that out later. And obviously what I want to do is I want to finish this path, and so this entire space is what I'm working with now. And I'm basically now scattering within this space. So there's a lot going on here, but I'm gonna try and break this down really simply, that I'm spacing objects across this path. I have a lot more control. If you're familiar with paths in Twinmotion, I've always been able to place things on path, but it's been a little hit or miss on the specifics of where they are, how many, and everything. The nice thing here is that this is dependent on the spacing. So again, the path here. Before I get into like actually throwing something on the path, these arrows are really great. I can use these arrows as a way of knowing exactly where any object I place on this path will go, and that's really helpful, because maybe I don't want to place 500 objects on here and have my computer have to work really hard to render all of that out just to know where these things are going to end up, because at the end of the day, I want to know where they are and then just end up placing them on. So anyways, we've got the random seed, which I'll get back to here in a minute. The path tension here, again, default by 50%, which all that means is that I'm going to get a default curve in here. As I change this, you can see I get 100%, so it's straight. Just really, these things aren't too crazy, and they're kind of obvious, but let's put this back to 50%. Random lateral offset is default 0, which means that every single object I place on here is going to go directly on this path. And if I start to add lateral offset, you can see that there might be some randomness to where these elements or these arrows, these objects ultimately end up on the path. And then count or distance. Basically, do I want, throughout this entire path, do I want a total of 10? Do I want 50? And you can see obviously the random lateral has, you can see the difference here. Or do I want by distance? 1 meter off. Again, we need to probably change the units, but for the sake of this video, not necessarily going to worry about that. Maybe I want them to be spaced every 2 meters or 5. You could see, do I want more or less? Do I want less control? Do I want random order, as in randomly placed? That's not really something we're after. So really, you have a whole lot of control over here, which is really fantastic. And then coming back here to the random seed, it's basically, obviously random seed, if you're familiar with the idea, is that I'm using the same options here, the same controls for this path, this spacing, but I want a new option, if you're that type of thing. And it's as simple as that, which is really great to see the different options we have there. Now let's start placing actually placing an object. So a lot of times we want to use this with, obviously, any object can work here. I think current limitations now, we can't necessarily have like an animated object, which obviously we'll get there, which is fantastic. I don't think I want this many animated objects yet, but as far as vegetation goes, let's place a few trees here. And I can do this, obviously put one tree, but I need to drag it into this asset here. And all of a sudden you can see this is absurd. Clearly not something that we want here. Okay. So with that, we can see that we've got the scattering per object. We had just completely different set of options here. This is basically the same settings here, more or less, but it's per object. So now I have this particular tree selected, and I can decide, the scaling of this tree kind of on a global scale. Do I want this to snap to the surface? Typically, I probably would. If it's a tree, it's probably going to stay on the ground. Do I want to change the rotation? Maybe I do. Do I want random rotation? Heck yes, I do. This is foliage we're talking about, so I want something like that. That's all fine. Do I want to align this? And that's not necessarily easy to see, but basically, do I want to align this to the path itself? So that's fine. The nice thing is, depending on the type of object you end up with up here, you have specific asset properties, and this applies to the type of asset. In this case, it's a tree. So I have all of these, honestly, new season options here, which is fantastic. We'll get to some more of these details here later in the video. That's fine, which is great. And obviously, this is all within the asset itself. Now, maybe I want to, this is the type of thing where if I want a little more randomness to maybe the size, I would reduce the count here for this particular tree, and I might have a separate form of scattering using the same tree, but just at a different scale. So there's a lot of things that we can do here. Clearly, there's things that we're going to worry about when it comes to the spacing and not. For the sake of this video, let's go ahead and add another element, which is great. And maybe it's a rock or something like that. This rock, it looks great. And so obviously what's going to happen is, again, because we're working with one space or one scattering, we're going to basically replace some of those trees because it's all based on the scattering count. In this case, I could put the distance here. Obviously, we're going to get more or less. There's a lot that you can start to play with it. But again, if I were to remove these, we'd get those arrows back and you can get a nice preview of what that might look like. You can see the random seed working here because it's going to start replacing the locations of some materials or some assets with others in different locations. And the rotation, kind of all of that's going to be randomized with this random seed, which is really great. And again, with the rock, if I select it, I may or may not have some specific asset properties. You can see here the rock is just a rock. I don't have any way of changing the asset itself, but I do have options like the tree to change the scale or anything like that. So I can make these rocks small, all kinds of things like that, random rotation. It's really great. There's so much that we can do here. So that's awesome. If I were to click this again, we'd basically just go into creating a completely separate spacing. So if I wanted something else here in the middle, I could do something else. But now we're in, if I go to my scene, a completely separate one here, which obviously you can choose to do that or not, but just kind of know that this pen is going to create a brand new one. But the control that I have with this is fantastic. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this one. We don't necessarily need that one. Let's delete the right one. We don't necessarily need this one. But the nice thing is I can add a point here and I can always move these. I could even move this up, not like that, but like this. So we can start working in 3D. And you can see my align working or not working depending on how you want it to function right there. So if I wanted to fix this, I can go to the tree and I can say snap to surface, or I can basically keep it on the path itself, which this starts to get real interesting. Depending on what kind of object you're working with, this would be great if it were a bird or something that might fly in the air like a plane. Not every day I see trees like this necessarily, but then I can start to align. We can really see this working. Do I want this aligned straight up and down? Typically, I would, again, if it's a tree. But let's go ahead and put this back down on the ground. It makes a whole lot more sense for that. But you can see some of the options we have with this are just insane. And we've only looked at one tool here. Then the next one here is along the same lines. Again, we're going to go to the populate. I've got Of course, paths and urban, all of these are not necessarily new, but the place, we just looked at spacing, but now area. So you take everything that we just looked at with the spacing, and then we come over here and we do the exact same thing. Now this is, again, nothing that's too different from the spacing, but you can see immediately what we're doing here. So we are applying these objects within an area as opposed to spacing throughout kind of the perimeter of an area that we set. So we have basically the same type of things here where I can change the path tension, the spacing, basically where do I want these, how often, random spacing, of course. The probability here is basically how probable this is all going to align. So basically how accurate is this? I'd probably keep this at 0.5 because it's not so clear as to what this does. We'll save this for another video. Edge fall off is interesting. So basically as you get closer to the edge that you can set, I can set basically 1 meter here, this area is going to fall off. So you can imagine kind of fading in, fading out, which depending on what it is, maybe it's a grass. That might be really something that we're really interested in. And obviously you can basically kind of pull that in or just completely not include that at all. Again, we've got the same random seed, but let's again place another object here. Let's make it a little more interesting and stick with outside, but maybe some bushes here. Something that might fit here within the landscape. This looks great. Drop that in. And so yeah, there's a ton here. And like I said before, we have the different options with the asset itself. It just so happens that this is foliage, and so I have specific tints and size. You can change everything this way. That's great. And then the per object, obviously, you know, the size of this thing, everything like that we just saw with the spacing as opposed to the area. That's great. So because I might want to see a few more because of what this is, this being an area. So I can come over here to the scattering itself and I can decide, well, you know, what's the spacing going to be? If I increase the spacing, obviously there will be less. If I decrease it, I can see, well, we're getting close to having this entire area be filled with the spacing. Can I go below 1 meter? That I cannot. So just kind of know that those are some of the limitations that we have here. Obviously the random spacing, you can see that, you know, they slightly shift here. Probability is basically how dense it is, almost, it seems. How probable is it going to be to follow this spacing? Again, play with it. I don't know what probability means, like the term itself when it comes to these settings, but you could see the effect that it has if I want something like that. And now we can really see the edge fall off working. As I increase that, everything is falling into the middle here. Let's go to top view so we can get this working a little better. We can start to see that distance really coming into play. And you can see just the options that we have here are immense as far as to make some of this look more natural. Obviously, what I'm doing here is for example purposes, and I'm not going for a final rendering here necessarily, so I'm not necessarily going to achieve anything looking overly realistic, but you can start to see if you start to layer some of these on. If I were to add, what I can see happening a lot is duplicating this area and then having basically the same kind of area, but with slightly different settings and different objects. So imagine layering grass and this and that. Obviously, I can add more objects to this if I want, and then we're going to see the same effect. Some of these are going to be replaced, and you can start to see that. It really, as many as I want, it's great here. I can start to get different ideas, different options here with the size and scale of the objects. But again, we're really based on the area itself and the contents based on the settings. So you might start to duplicate these things to truly layer them on top of each other. So lots of different things that we can get here, but really the effect that we get is just amazing. And the control we have is amazing. I really like this more from the perspective of exporting, because what I would like to do in my workflow generally is that when I was working with the different populate options, I really would go more towards the paint and just kind of dust this whole area with vegetation, and that's great. That still works in similar ways, but this will give you a lot more control, and you may not have, you know, I would avoid using the scatter if you can, because for example, if I were to scatter on this starting surface, the starting ground, oh, that's so much computing power. That's so many things that you don't need. You're only looking at one direction at a time. So things like that. So we've kind of exhausted this new feature, which is great. And it's just one new feature. Okay, the next thing here, you might have noticed is as we've looked around here, but there are these different layer IDs, and they're basically rendering layers. And really 90% of objects that you come across within Twinmotion now, even just a one-off tree, if I were to place this here, this object also has a layer ID. So really anything that might be a true object within Twinmotion is going to have a layer ID. And so first of all, what is that? Well, let's enable this and see. So I don't have a ton of different options here, but basically what this means is that when you export an image or a video, you're going to have the option of exporting also layer IDs. And it's hard to say, I might try and find an example here, but layer ID is basically, if you wanted to take this into post-processing like Photoshop, this will basically allow you to give you a layer to select from. So basically every object that shows up on layer 1 is going to be exported with a certain color, a certain level of grayness or something, so that you can just select that color in Twinmotion and easily select all the objects associated to that layer ID. People have been asking about this forever, and it's really great. Depending on the amount of post-processing you do, it might be something that you want to do for sure. But again, that's going to be, you're going to have every option, or you can add different layers. Every object will have that option if you want. And if it's not, it's just going to show kind of as it appears when you export, that type of thing, which is great. Okay, simplified the material creation process. Going to materials here, it's great. This is really some nice additions we have here. If I want to create a material, I can just one click, create a standard material, and I'm off to the races. That's it, I'm done. And obviously we can clean this up, but I can now click and create a standard material with one click. Very nice. The next would be improved fabric material. So again, very interesting stuff. Not using fabric a lot, but if you do anything with interiors, my guess is there are a lot of fabric. So first of all, we can come over here to materials. And if I click this very bottom, you can see this corner is solid, and it will expand this view, and we can make a specific type of material. And we see that we have fabric right there, and that's great. So what's the real difference with fabric? Well, first of all, we have this fuzzy option. So I'm going to create an object, just a generic primitive object. So just take this box here, and I'm not going to apply this fabric material. So let's go ahead and go to materials and then come down to fabric, and we can just overlay any one of these fabrics. This looks like a great fabric. And we can zoom in to this. Let's go ahead and get out of media mode, zoom into this fabric, and we can see what we're working with. So let's go ahead and select this material, and we can see that we have a couple of options when it comes to fabric, and we have a standard and a thin. So standard, again, it's going to be just your fabric, your pretty standard fabric. But a lot of times that these fabrics are going to be thin. All the like actual typical fabrics that you see, like a wool, some of these cottons or muslin, it's going to be thinned. And so what's the difference between a standard and a thin? Well, let's go back to this one, this muslin. And I can always change it to standard, but you're not going to get quite the look that you may not get the look that you're necessarily going for. But let's change this back to thin, and we can see there's a lot going on here. So first of all, use fuzzy, which is quite an interesting term. We have lots of different options here, and I'm going to say this again for a separate video, but it's going to do what it says. You know, like how fuzzy is the material. We have different options with what this material really should look like and how it should render. It's kind of hard to see this for sure, but some of the ideas are that you might have a material that is thin. It's got translucency. You could see through it. And so that's really important here. So looking at this thin material, this thin fabric material, we can come down here and see opacity. By default, we can see we're going to use this mask and this opacity map. We may or may not have a map itself, but it's nice that we can apply that. Lucency, we can see through it or not. It is kind of hard to tell with some of these different effects going on, but an interior shot is going to really, really bring this out. And obviously we can decide if we want to have a translucency map, all of that. There's quite a lot of things here. So again, depending on how opaque, depending on how translucent, but whenever we come over here to this fabric that is a standard, scrolling down, yeah, we have an opacity, which we may or may not use an opacity map or not. And generally speaking, if this is going to be a standard fabric, you're not going to be able to see through it, which means we don't have a translucency option at all. Scrolling back down on this muslin cloth, we can see translucency is there. And we can apply a map. We can make it look a little more transparent or not. So again, I'll save this for a separate video, but lots of different options here. And we have that ability, whether we're including fuzzy or not, but it's a standard or thin. And so the fuzzy part is basically a part of the fabric itself, and the fact that it's a fabric, and that's going to be available for us to the standard and thin. So the main difference between the standard and the thin is that the thin will give us a translucency layer that we can actually add a map to if we want, but then that will allow us to see through the fabric as if it's not a fully opaque, thick fabric, which is cool. All right, moving on now, we have a foliage material. So if you looked here, we could see that there is a foliage material. And if we add that here, this is something that we can now add. And so let's go ahead and create another primitive material or primitive object, and maybe make this a slightly bigger box. And this box is great. Okay, now let's go ahead and apply this foliage. Now, it looks weird because it's literally just foliage, and that's the only thing here. And you might be wondering, like, what the heck is going on with this box and this material? Well, that is because what we're looking at is something a bit different. So let's go ahead and increase this box, and we can see what we're looking at here. Again, we need to select this material. I can't see myself using this too much because it's based on this. So basically, it's a leaf. It is literally just a leaf. And what we're working with there is the fact that it is only a leaf. It's only going to show up as a leaf. And all that means is that I can't see myself using it that often, but it depends. It really depends. One limitation right off the bat is that it's solely based on the scale of this map. I don't have any scale options when it comes to this particular material, which is kind of too bad. And so you might say, well, that's a bit odd. And so maybe for that reason, we want a bit of a larger box over here, and go ahead and put this foliage material here so we can see more. Yeah, again, so here is the map itself, and you might wonder why this is happening, and that's just because by default the foliage material is two-sided, which makes sense, but it's reacting to the wind, and that's what that is. So if I uncheck that, we can see it. Now we're just clipping. Let's go ahead and move this box actually up a little bit, so we're not clipping anymore, and select the material once more. And we can see that, yeah, as I select the wind, it's going to now react with the wind, which that's why it's moving so slightly. That's great. Again, it's great. It's foliage. It's going to be hard to determine what the application for this might be, but you can turn these things off if you want. That's not a huge deal. But what I really want to focus on is the fact that we have these other options here that we don't see in other materials. And that is, within the texture, we have this back face fade. And so depending on the material, depending on what it is, if you layered these together, you could basically fade certain layers of it so you could see more of these things happening at once. Again, we have pretty standard details here, but this is kind of the main feature of the foliage material itself, and that is seasons, foliage and seasons. So obviously foliage should and kind of does react to the seasons, which means we have a couple of options here. We have using global seasons, or we can force seasons. Basically, do we want to determine the season or not? Seasons are determined in many ways, but if I want to force it, I could say, well, this material is going to be this season no matter what. Anyways, using global seasons, we can see we have a season color and a leaves life cycle. This might be weird as to what this really is, but if I select this, I actually have many options for what this looks like. So to get an idea of what this really looks like, we can force the season and see, well, we're going from like a spring to a spring. You can imagine that. It's not the best way of laying this out, but you go from spring all the way to winter, and then from winter all the way back to spring. So a year, more or less. And if we want to take that idea, we can use the season's color and kind of translate that idea to the color. So really, as I go through spring and into summer, these are the colors that I'm going to see projected in the foliage itself. And of course, as I get to the winter, anything we see black here, it's going to go away. Likewise, the leaves life cycle, if it just so happens that these are leaves, are going to react in the exact same way. Anything here, it appears that anything in white is going to be seen, like we're actually seeing the object. This is going to apply to like that idea applies to maps and materials. So if I were to change the way any one of these season masks, it's going to operate differently. So the best way to really show what this looks like is to start changing the season. You can see that I'm changing the season, and you can almost imagine the slider fitting in within this material, that map there. And as I get to the winter, it's going to fade away. Like literally this black, once I hit black, it's going to go away. And obviously very quickly, and that's the fading away is determined by this leaf life cycle. So if I change this here, it's going to be back because I'm now in the white. But if I change this and I come back into the spring, it's going to be gone, completely gone. This entire area is black. So again, this is something very specific. And I can't say that I love this mainly just because I haven't found a good application for it yet, but quite a lot of options here. If I look at vegetation, we can look at grass. So you can see that these are literally just the grass, which is nice. If you want this to kind of appear to look flat, obviously hay, like there's a lot of different ways that this could work that really all it's doing is we're changing the texture. Now, something that we could kind of experiment with, and this will definitely take a separate video, but imagine we change this texture from literally like a PNG into something completely different. But because it's a foliage, we would still have the options of having essentially the material change the color and be basically able to react based on the season. So again, lots of tests that we can go on and that we'll save for another video. So very interesting stuff. So getting away from foliage now, let's go back to some of these ways of exporting media and some of the options that we have here. So obviously we've got our image, and that's nothing new here, but we have a film back option, and film back is going to be within the camera. We can see we have the lens. We can select a specific lens, focal length and details, everything like that. Again, the parallelism is there, but we've got the film back option, which is here. Again, this is something I probably won't necessarily use a lot because I'm just working through architecture. I could see very specific things here, but if I'm maybe creating some sort of a cinematic or trailer or something and I want this particular preset, I can do that. So film back, what is that? I can enable this, and all this means is that the screen that I'm going to have and work with is going to be based on, let's call it, real world examples of these different film back options. So for example, I even have IMAX 70mm. So if you watched Oppenheimer, it was one of the few movies that was actually recorded with a specific IMAX 70mm film. So what does this all mean? Well, I can literally film my scene or take this shot or create a video or create something like that within Twinmotion that is shot as if I were shooting the same way that Oppenheimer was shot. That's cool. Again, I can't see myself doing this necessarily like all that much, but there's tons of different options here, which is great. You get the specific options here, the sensor width and height, so you can change that as you need to. Obviously, really decide if you want something specific, you can get it. I like this a lot just because it's another option, something else. I don't necessarily see myself changing it that much, but I like having this option nonetheless. Really cool stuff. All right, so the camera settings themselves have revamped just a bit in that some of the options that we have within the environment are now within the camera, primarily the blooms and things like that. So things that make a little bit more sense with the camera are there now. This is really interesting, really, really interesting. And so we've always been familiar with a video and how that works. We can basically determine how we want this video to go by placing different sequences here. So, and I can always scrub here and see, well, hey, we're making a video. Again, all the different camera options that we just looked at are available within the video as well, but we have something new called sequences. And first of all, what the heck is a sequence? The best way I can describe it is it's a video with more options. And those options, if we were to make a sequence here, are that we have different tracks. Again, I'm not going to explore every single little thing, but when it comes to creating a sequence versus a video, I'll save that for a separate video in of itself. But there are a few things here. We basically have the ability to add keyframes and have different tracks, and it's quite a lot, if I'm being honest. So just to simplify this, I can scrub throughout this action camera, which we'll get to in a second, this camera, just like I can in a video. There's nothing new here, but I can come along here and create basically a separate frame. And all that is a key time. If you're familiar with video production at all, they're generally using keyframes. So basically you've got a sequence, which is a video, and then throughout that video, you can cut it up, not necessarily like these different keyframes. And that's nice because I can determine where this keyframe is. And so nothing has happened between this keyframe and that one, but like we did before, if I'm going to start here at this location, maybe I want to come over here and set this location to be that keyframe. So again, we can see this is operating just like the video we looked at. And you can see as I get to this frame, which happens to be like the center, it's a bit weird, but once I get to the center or the location of this key time, if I select this, I can see the key time, then I'm at that location. That's great. Now, the action camera itself, which it means that I've got different details that I can cut in and out. Do I want the smooth speed? Do I want it kind of smoothing into these different keyframes? Do I want to override camera roll itself? Again, these are different things that we're going to get to as we get into the sequence itself in a separate video. But again, right now, it looks exactly like the video, but I want to show you this. This button is not anything new necessarily, but it's a media preview, which means I can go into my actual scene and watch this, kind of move across it. And, I can see what's happening. But this is the absolute best thing. This is the thing we've all been wanting whenever it comes to video within Twinmotion. And we've had this in Inkscape and other rendering programs before, but I can physically see this path and I can move the path other than just by updating where I'm at in a specific location on my timeline and using this update. I can physically move the camera and see the camera. Like amazing, amazing. So if I wanted to move this start location, I can select this keyframe and I can move it just like I can anything else, which is absolutely fantastic right there. It's amazing. One limitation we have with this is that, yeah, I can see it, but I can't physically select these points yet, which it's too bad. We'll get there. We will get there, I promise. The nice thing is that we can see the path, but if I wanted to update this, I can come over here, and what I have within the video is obviously all the options, but if I were to select one, I can see that I have sequence there as well. And you can see that the icon there for sequence is there. So it's going to function and export and everything exactly like a video, which is really great to see. All right, so obviously we covered the action camera. We'll cover that in a later video, but there's quite a lot with that too. Obviously the media preview is just great. This is not necessarily anything new, whether I want this to update constantly or not. This is right here, high resolution, low, really nice stuff, and really makes editing videos or sequences in Twinmotion just amazing now. Deterministic animation. This is going to be hard for me to explain, but basically, whenever I had a video, I might have had an animation playing, and I can't necessarily determine where the animation in the video is going to start and how it's going to perform. I made a video years ago now on, basically, if I wanted an animated video, or like basically a building being animated and the kind of the pieces assembling and everything like that, I couldn't determine which pieces kind of fired when and just everything like that. So I have the ability to do that a little bit more now, which is awesome. Again, that'll be a completely separate video, but if I have two animations that I have basically the same settings, same seed for the animation and everything, then they're going to perform the exact same way when I export. And so that's kind of one of the things that just kind of makes sense whenever I'm trying to export something. So I can come over here and look at this guy. I've got lots of different animations here. So basically this seed is, again, he might be doing the same thing in the same settings, but the seed itself is changing things up. So I could determine what the seed is and use the same seed for different videos, different images, different exports to make sure that this guy looks the exact same. He's doing the same animation at the same time when I export. So it's really interesting stuff. This is not necessarily the final, but this is the main final update when it comes to Twinmotion 2024.1. And that has everything to do with animations, and love animations. We've been pretty limited by animations. If we go to tools, animators, rotators, and translators. So let's first look at rotators, and we're just going to add a standard rotation here. This in of itself is nothing new. We've had all these settings before. Again, this is nothing new. And likewise, I'm going to add a translator here. And again, this is nothing new. So these two things, there's nothing new with them. But the fact now is that we can take an object, and if you know me at all, we have to go to the complete depths of immaturity. And we've got to choose something very specific for this. And I apologize, but we have to do it. I can't resist. So let's place this toilet here, because this is totally something we would see within the wild. But like before, we've always been able to apply an animation to an object. That's like a rotator or a translator. So that's nothing new. So let's come up here, and if we wanted to actually add this object, we can object link and then select the object, and it's going to do exactly what we kind of thought and expected. Well, expected we would never see a toilet do, but here we go. That is happening. Maybe I want to loop this around, and now I have this lovely toilet spinning around in my scene. That's fine. But like I said before, we have the translator, and I can do the exact same thing with the translator. If I wanted to link this object right there, the toilet is now rising and falling. So, well, we can actually link these things together, and it turns out I want to actually unlink the toilet from my translator. I don't want that to happen, but I want the toilet to come back and just be a part of my rotator right now. So again, we'll bring this back. We will add this toilet to our rotator, make this 360 and loop it around. Okay, but if I wanted to not only have this toilet rotate, but rotate and translate at the same time, that is now possible within Twinmotion. And it is as simple as taking whatever other animation. It could be two rotators, right? It could be more than that. But I'm going to take this translator and just drag it and basically have the rotator be the parent. And I can do this right here, and we can see what is happening. Quite a lot is happening. So I'm getting basically this rotator is now rotating the translator and this toilet. And that makes perfect sense. Now I just need to link the toilet to the translator. So let's go ahead and stop this from playing so I can actually unlink the toilet. And I'm going to make sure that the toilet is now linked to the translator. So we can do this right there. Make sure this plays. I mean, we're not seeing it rotate because the rotation is not playing. But once I play the rotation, I can see that, yes, of course, the toilet is now spinning in midair and rising up and down. So again, we've achieved the maximum level of immaturity possible. You know, what else is new here? But look at this. This is fantastic. This is not something that we could have done before in Twinmotion. We were limited to rotating the toilet or translating the toilet. So now we can do both at the same time. I think my life is nearly complete when it comes to all of the animation updates within Twinmotion. So what more could we ask for? But gosh, this is a long video. I'm so sorry for that. I said it might be shorter. It's not. It's really not. So I hope this did cover everything that you might want to know about Twinmotion 2024.1. I promise we will go into further videos, most of which I can almost guarantee you are not going to be all that short either, because all of these different features are quite specific, and the direction I can see Twinmotion is going is, yeah, it's kind of falling within the Unreal Engine, but at the same time, it's very simple. As some of these things are so detailed, it's still a very simple program, and you can get off the ground running very quickly. So that will do it for all the new crazy updates within Twinmotion 2024.1, and I'm so happy to see this type of thing. But if you enjoyed this type of content, if you learned something, please demolish that like button. Really helps me out quite a lot. I'm on my own as an architect now. If you stuck around this long, I thank you so much. You can schedule a call with me if you've got a project or just want to talk. In the description below, you can find that on my website. So again, thank you for sticking around this long to look at all the new Twinmotion updates. I'll see you in the next Twinmotion video. Have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one.